The crystalline towers of the Calvary homeworld reflected the light of 3 suns, creating patterns of rainbow colors across the floating cities that had stood for over 3,000 years. High Priestess Valara walked through the grand temple with slow, measured steps, her luminescent blue skin flickering like a dying star. Around her, the other priests and priestesses moved in silence, their usual songs of prayer replaced by an atmosphere of dread that hung heavy in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. The war room beneath the temple was filled with military officers and council members, all of them wearing expressions of defeat that would have been unthinkable just 6 months ago. Admiral Theron stood at the center of the room, his tall frame hunched with exhaustion, his 4 arms hanging limply at his sides as he gestured weakly toward the holographic display that showed the current state of their empire. 12 colonies were marked in red, signifying complete loss. Another 30 showed yellow, meaning they were under attack and would fall within days. The Void Swarm moved across their territory like a plague, consuming everything in its path and leaving behind only empty husks of worlds where millions had once lived and thrived. Valara approached the display and touched one of the red markers with her long fingers. This had been the farming colony of Deltara, where she had spent her childhood learning the old ways from her grandmother. Now it was gone, along with everyone she had known there. The swarm had taken only 3 hours to completely drain the planet of all life energy. Admiral Theron spoke in a voice that carried the weight of countless defeats. He explained how their fleet had engaged the swarm at the outer rim with every weapon they possessed. They had used quantum disruptors that could tear apart matter at the molecular level. They had deployed reality bombs that collapsed sections of space-time. They had even sacrificed an entire battle group by flying ships directly into a star, creating a supernova that should have destroyed anything within light years. The swarm had simply absorbed all of it. Every attack made them stronger. Every weapon became fuel for their growth. The entities phased through shields as if they didn't exist, moved through the vacuum of space faster than anything the Calvari had ever encountered, and coordinated their attacks with a precision that suggested a unified intelligence spanning entire star systems. Counselor Dravix, an elderly Calvari whose purple skin had faded to almost gray with age, raised his voice in frustration. He demanded to know how this was possible. The Calvari were the oldest civilization in the known galaxy. They had explored dimensions beyond normal space. They had built weapons that could crack planets in half. How could they be losing to an enemy that seemed to have no physical form, no central command, no weakness that could be exploited? Valara listened to the debate that followed, the same arguments that had been repeated in countless meetings over the past weeks. Some wanted to retreat to the core worlds and establish a defensive perimeter. Others suggested abandoning their empire entirely and fleeing to unexplored regions of space. A few spoke of surrender, though no one knew if the swarm could even be communicated with or if it would accept anything other than total consumption. She knew none of these options would work. The swarm was too fast, too adaptable, too relentless. Running would only delay the inevitable. There was only one choice left, one terrible option that she had been avoiding because of what it would mean, what it would unleash upon the galaxy. Valara raised her hand, and the room fell silent. She told them about the Codex of Last Resorts, a forbidden text kept in the deepest vault of the Grand Temple. This book contained knowledge that the ancient Calvari had deemed too dangerous for normal use, secrets about the galaxy that were meant to remain hidden until the absolute end of all things. The council members shifted uncomfortably. They all knew the stories about the Codex, the warnings passed down through generations about the terrible prices that came with the knowledge it contained. But Valara continued speaking, her voice steady despite the fear she felt in her core. She told them about humanity, the species that had been sealed away by the precursors, locked behind dimensional barriers so strong that nothing had been able to break through them for 500 years. The beings that came from a death world, a planet so hostile that simply surviving there required a level of adaptability and aggression that terrified every other species in the galaxy. The legends said that humans treated war not as a necessary evil, but as an art form to be perfected. They made weapons from everything they touched. They bonded with predators and turned them into companions. They refused to surrender even when logic and reason demanded it. They fought with a creativity and ruthlessness that made even the old gods uncomfortable. Admiral Theron protested immediately. He said the stories about humans were meant to frighten children. tales told to teach young cavalry about the dangers of unchecked aggression and the importance of civilization. Humanity couldn't possibly be as dangerous as the legend suggested. No species could be that violent and still survive to develop space travel. But Valara had read the Codex. She had seen the historical records that the precursors had left behind. The humans had fought wars that lasted generations. They had split atoms and created weapons that could destroy their entire world. They had faced extinction-level events multiple times and always found ways to survive. And most terrifying of all, they had been the only species to ever make the old gods retreat in fear. The old gods, beings of pure energy that existed before the current universe was formed, had tried to judge humanity and found them too dangerous to exist alongside other civilized species. But when they attempted to eliminate Earth, the humans had fought back with such ferocity that the gods had chosen to withdraw rather than pay the price of victory. That was when the precursors had sealed humanity away, not to punish them but to protect the rest of the galaxy from what they might become. Counselor Drevix demanded to know why Valara thought releasing humanity would help them. If humans were such monsters, wouldn't they just destroy the Calvari along with the swarm? What guarantee did they have that humanity would fight for them, rather than against them? Valara explained that humans had one trait that made them unique. Among all the species in the known galaxy, they formed bonds with other beings. They protected those they considered allies with the same ferocity they showed to enemies. They had a concept they called loyalty, a willingness to sacrifice themselves for others that went beyond simple survival instinct. If the Calvari could convince humanity that they were worth protecting, then they would gain allies who would never stop fighting, never give up, never surrender until either victory was achieved or death claimed them. The debate continued for hours. Some council members argued that releasing humanity was too risky, that they would be trading one extinction-level threat for another. Others pointed out that they were already facing extinction, so what did they have to lose? A few suggested trying to find other solutions first, but Valara reminded them that they had already tried everything else and failed. Finally, Admiral Theron called for a vote. The decision had to be unanimous according to Calvary law, as summoning humanity would affect every living being in their empire. One by one, the council members raised their hands in agreement. Even those who feared humanity more than the swarm voted yes, because at least with humans there was a chance, however slim, of survival. Valara descended into the deepest vault of the Grand Temple, carrying the Codex of Last Resorts and a heavy burden of responsibility. The ritual to break the precursor seal would require all of her spiritual energy, and might kill her in the process, but that was a price she was willing to pay if it meant saving her people. The ancient chamber glowed with power as she began chanting the words written in the Codex, words in a language older than the Calvari civilization itself. Reality began to bend around her as the spell took effect, reaching across dimensions to find the sealed pocket of space where humanity had been imprisoned for 5 centuries. She only hoped that when the humans emerged, they would remember mercy along with war, compassion along with destruction, and that they would choose to fight for the Calvari, rather than simply adding them to the list of casualties in whatever terrible conflict was about to unfold. The cold darkness of deep space surrounded the USS Freedom as it drifted silently through the Oort cloud at the edge of what had once been the solar system. Inside the colony ship, 300 crew members slept in cryogenic pods, their bodies frozen in time while the automated systems guided them toward a distant world that promised a new beginning for humanity. Captain Jake Morrison had gone to sleep 500 years ago, believing he would wake up in orbit around a planet called New Terra, a world that surveys had shown could support human life with minimal terraforming. The sudden shock of awakening felt like being hit by lightning. Jake's eyes snapped open as alarms blared throughout the ship and emergency lights flooded his cryopod with red illumination. His muscles screamed in protest as he forced himself to move, fighting against the effects of long sleep that made every motion feel like pushing through thick mud. The pod hissed and released him, and he stumbled out onto the cold metal floor of the cryo bay, gasping for air as his lungs remembered how to function properly. All around him, other pods were opening as the ship's emergency protocols woke key personnel. Lieutenant Emma Clark emerged from her pod nearby, her short dark hair plastered to her head with cryofluid, her brown eyes wide with confusion and alarm. Commander Lucas Bennett pulled himself out with practiced efficiency, despite having been frozen for half a millennium, his military training overriding the discomfort of rapid awakening. Jake forced his legs to carry him toward the bridge, other crew members joining him as they moved through corridors that felt strange after so long in sleep. The ship's artificial gravity felt wrong somehow, fluctuating slightly as if something was interfering with the generators. Emergency lights cast everything in shades of red and shadow, making the familiar passages of the Freedom feel alien and threatening. The bridge was chaos when they arrived. Console displays flickered with warnings and error messages. The main view screen showed nothing but static. Chief Communications Officer Nora Phillips was already at her station, her fingers flying across controls as she tried to make sense of what was happening to their ship. Jake dropped into the captain's chair and immediately began pulling up system reports. What he saw made no sense at all. According to the navigation computer, they were no longer in the Oort cloud. They weren't even in the Milky Way galaxy anymore. Somehow, impossibly, the Freedom had been transported across millions of light years in an instant. Emma reached her station and began running diagnostics on the sensor array. Her voice was tight with controlled panic as she reported that they had been pulled out of normal space by some kind of massive energy field, a force so powerful that it had grabbed their entire ship and yanked them across half the universe. The readings suggested they were now in the Andromeda system, a location that should have taken thousands of years to reach even at maximum faster than light speed. Lucas moved to stand beside Jake's chair, his gray eyes scanning the data with the calculating gaze of a career military officer. He stated what they were all thinking, that nothing in known physics had the power to move a ship this size across such distances instantly. Whatever had done this was working with technology far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered or imagined. The static on the main view screen suddenly cleared, and what they saw made everyone on the bridge fall silent. A massive crystalline structure floated in space before them, easily the size of a small moon, its surface glowing with strange lights that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Around this structure hung dozens of alien vessels, ships that looked nothing like human designs, their hulls organic and flowing rather than angular and mechanical. But it was the condition of these ships that truly caught their attention. Many were damaged, their hulls torn open as if something had simply bitten through the metal. Debris floated everywhere. Some ships were burning despite being in the vacuum of space, their fires fueled by some unknown energy source. This was clearly the aftermath of a battle, and whoever had fought here had lost badly. Nora announced that they were being hailed by the crystalline structure. The signal was coming through on frequencies the Freedom's computers didn't recognize, using a language that wasn't in any of their databases. The translation software began working immediately, analyzing patterns and attempting to create a working understanding of the alien communication. A holographic figure materialized on the bridge, and the humans got their first look at an alien species. The being was tall and slender, with luminescent blue skin that flickered with inner light. She had large eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness and desperation. Her body was wrapped in robes that appeared to be made of light itself, shifting and changing colors as she moved. The translation came through in choppy, stilted phrases as the computer worked to interpret the alien language. The being identified herself as High Priestess Valara of the Calvary Empire. She spoke of breaking a seal that had held humanity contained for 5 centuries, of committing an act of desperation born from dying hope. She said her people were being consumed by an enemy that could not be stopped by any conventional means. Valara's words chilled everyone on the bridge. She explained that the Calvari knew what humans were, knew what they were capable of doing. She said they had summoned humanity because they had no other choice, no other options left, no other hope of survival. The way she spoke made it clear that calling for human help had not been an easy decision, that the Calvary feared humanity almost as much as they feared whatever was killing them. Jake leaned forward in his chair and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What exactly did the Calvari think humans were capable of doing? What made them so desperate that they would break a seal that had held for 500 years to ask for help from a species they clearly feared? Valara's holographic image flickered as she gathered her thoughts. Her next words would echo in Jake's mind for the rest of his life. She called humans the Death Worlders, the species that treated war as an art form to be perfected across generations. She said humans made weapons from everything they touched, that they refused to surrender even when logic and mathematics demanded defeat. She spoke of how humanity had made the old gods flee in fear, beings of immense power who had ruled the galaxy before the current civilizations rose. The priestess explained that the Calvari needed monsters now. They needed beings who could fight without honor, who could win without following the rules of civilized warfare, who could do whatever was necessary to ensure survival. She offered to give humanity anything within the Calvari Empire's power if they would help fight off this extinction-level threat. Lucas stepped closer to Jake and spoke quietly so only the captain could hear. He suggested this might be a trap, that the Calvari could be luring them into an ambush or trying to use humanity as weapons against some other enemy. After 500 years in isolation, they had no way of knowing what the political situation in the galaxy might be or who could be trusted. But Jake was studying the damaged ships on the view screen, looking at the desperate expression on Valara's face, watching as Emma pulled up sensor data that showed massive energy signatures approaching their current position. The readings made the ship's threat detection system scream warnings that something enormous and dangerous was headed their way. Jake made a decision, based on instinct and the simple fact that this alien being had shown vulnerability by admitting fear and desperation. He told Valara to show them this enemy that had brought the Calvari Empire to its knees. They would look at the threat, assess the situation with human eyes and human military experience, and then decide if they could help or if they needed to leave immediately. What Valara showed them next would change everything. The holographic display shifted to show recorded footage from recent battles. The humans watched in growing horror as they saw the Void Swarm in action for the first time. It moved through space like living darkness, like shadows that had gained consciousness and hunger. Tendrils of pure black stretched across star systems, wrapping around planets and ships and stations, consuming everything they touched. The footage showed Calvary ships firing every weapon they possessed. Energy beams that could melt mountains splashed harmlessly against the swarm. Missiles that should have destroyed entire fleets simply vanished into the darkness and were never seen again. The swarm didn't just destroy its enemies, it erased them, left nothing behind but empty space where moments before there had been life and light and hope. Emma's voice was barely a whisper as she stated what the sensors were telling her. The energy signatures approaching their position matched the swarm. Whatever had destroyed the Calvari fleet was coming here, probably drawn by the energy released when humanity was pulled through dimensions. They had minutes at most before contact. Jake looked at his crew, seeing fear mixed with determination on their faces. They were 300 humans in a single colony ship, facing an enemy that had brought an entire galactic empire to the edge of extinction. By any logical measure, they should run, should jump to faster than light speed and leave this sector as quickly as possible. But humans had never been particularly logical when others needed help. Jake turned back to Valara's hologram and told her they would stay and fight. They would need. The war room aboard the USS Freedom had been hastily converted from a cargo bay, with holographic displays now covering every available wall space, and Calvari technology interfaced awkwardly with human systems. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the center of the room surrounded by his senior staff and several Calvari military advisors, all of them studying the footage that High Priestess Valara had provided. The images showed battle after battle, defeat after defeat, each one more devastating than the last. Valara's holographic form stood beside Admiral Theron as they explained what the Calvari had learned about the Void Swarm through months of desperate fighting. The entities existed in a state between dimensions, phasing in and out of normal space in ways that made them nearly impossible to target. They weren't organic life as humans or Calvari understood it, but they also weren't mechanical constructs or pure energy beings. They seemed to be something else entirely, something that violated the known laws of physics and biology. Commander Lucas Bennett asked the most important tactical question, wanting to know exactly how the swarm killed its victims. Understanding the enemy's methods of attack was the first step in developing effective countermeasures. Valara's response made several of the human crew members visibly uncomfortable. She explained that the swarm phased directly into ships and into living bodies, consuming what she called neural energy, or life force. The victims were left as empty shells, their minds completely gone, their bodies functioning but devoid of any consciousness or will. Entire planets had fallen silent within hours of the swarm's arrival. Billions of beings reduced to mindless husks that simply stood in place until their bodies eventually failed. Chief Science Officer Ryan Cooper leaned forward to study the sensor readings from previous engagements. His analytical mind was already working through the problem, categorizing information and looking for patterns that others might miss. He noted that the Calvari had thrown incredible amounts of firepower at the swarm, including antimatter warheads, singularity bombs, and weapons that could tear apart the fabric of space-time itself. Yet nothing had worked. Every attack either passed harmlessly through the entities or was absorbed and converted into energy that made the swarm stronger. Lieutenant Colonel Greg Patterson, the Freedom's chief military strategist, asked a question that made the Calvari look at him with confusion. He wanted to know if they had tried not fighting the swarm. Had they attempted retreat, evasion, or stealth tactics? Had they studied the enemy's behavior patterns, reproduction methods, or communication systems before engaging in direct combat? Admiral Theron responded with obvious pride in his voice, stating that the Calvari were warriors and did not hide from their enemies. Their military traditions stretched back thousands of years, built on principles of honor and direct engagement. The idea of retreating or avoiding battle was fundamentally opposed to everything they believed about warfare. Ryan's response was blunt and immediate. He called them fools for fighting an enemy they didn't understand. He explained that humans had learned long ago that you couldn't defeat a threat without first comprehending how it worked, what it wanted, and where its weaknesses lay. He told Jake that he needed samples of the swarm, detailed sensor data, and most importantly, the opportunity to observe these entities up close in their natural hunting behavior. Jake considered the request carefully. What Ryan was proposing was incredibly dangerous, essentially asking to get close enough to the swarm to study it while avoiding being consumed in the process. But the science officer was right. The Calvari had been fighting blindly, throwing power at a problem without understanding the fundamental nature of what they faced. Humans would need to approach this differently. He turned to Valara and asked if there were any locations nearby where the swarm was active, but not present in overwhelming numbers. Somewhere they could observe without committing to a full-scale battle. The priestess consulted with Admiral Theron briefly before responding that there was a research station on the fourth moon of Calvar Prime. The facility had been overrun 2 days ago, and the swarm was still there, feeding on residual energy from the scientists who had died in the attack. Jake made the decision immediately. They would send a stealth reconnaissance team to the station to gather intelligence. This was exactly the kind of mission that humans excelled at, going into dangerous situations with minimal support to collect information that could turn the tide of an entire war. He assembled a small team consisting of Ryan, Emma, and a squad of 6 Marines led by Sergeant Danny Price. The stealth shuttle they used was a marvel of human engineering, its hull coated with experimental materials that absorbed sensor sweeps and radar pulses rather than reflecting them. The craft approached the dead research station in complete silence, moving slowly to avoid creating any energy signatures that might alert the swarm to their presence. Through the cockpit windows, they could see the station floating dead in space, its lights extinguished, its hull marked with strange dark stains that seemed to move and shift even in the vacuum. Emma piloted the shuttle with steady hands while Ryan monitored every sensor they had, recording data about the swarm's behavior. Through the station's shattered windows, they could see the entities moving inside in what appeared to be coordinated patterns. The swarm flowed through the corridors like liquid shadow, dozens of individual entities moving in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single mind. Ryan's voice was barely a whisper as he pointed out that the movement wasn't random. The entities were following specific paths, cycling through the same routes over and over again with precise timing. He asked Emma to focus the sensors deeper into the station, searching for whatever might be coordinating this behavior. The instruments detected a very low-frequency pulse, something that operated just below the threshold of what their standard sensors could normally pick up. The signal was coming from somewhere deep in the heart of the facility. Against every survival instinct they possessed, the team made the decision to go deeper. They docked the shuttle at an airlock on the far side of the station and entered in full combat gear, their weapons modified with Calvari technology in hopes of having some effect against the swarm if things went wrong. Sergeant Price took point with 3 Marines, their eyes constantly scanning for threats while Ryan and Emma followed close behind with the other 3 Marines guarding their backs. The interior of the station was a nightmare. Bodies lay everywhere. Calvari scientists frozen in their final moments with expressions of terror on their faces, but their eyes were empty, devoid of any spark of life or consciousness. The swarm had left the physical shells intact while consuming everything that made these beings who they were. The team moved carefully around the corpses, trying not to think about the horror these people must have experienced in their final moments. They followed the signal deeper into the research facility, passing through laboratories filled with expensive equipment now sitting dormant and useless. The pulse grew stronger with each corridor they traversed, and the swarm entities grew more numerous. Several times they had to freeze in place as shadows flowed past them in the darkness, the entities seemingly unaware of the humans' presence thanks to the stealth technology in their suits. Finally, they reached the central core of the station, and what they found there changed everything. A massive node of void energy pulsed in the middle of what had once been the main research lab, a concentration of swarm consciousness that seemed to coordinate all the smaller entities around it. The thing was roughly spherical, about 3 meters in diameter, and it radiated darkness like a black hole radiates gravity. Ryan immediately began recording every detail, his scientific instruments analyzing the node from every angle. Emma set up additional sensors while the Marines formed a protective perimeter. For several minutes they simply observed, watching as the node pulsed and the entities around it responded to each pulse like dancers following music only they could hear. Then Ryan noticed something crucial. Every 7.3 seconds, the node went dim for a fraction of an instant, its glow fading as it redirected energy to the network of entities under its control. During that brief moment, the coordinated movement of the swarm faltered, the entities losing their perfect synchronization for just a heartbeat before the node came back to full power. Ryan's whispered words carried the weight of revelation. This was the weakness they had been looking for. The swarm couldn't be hurt directly because it existed partially outside normal space, but the nodes were more firmly anchored in reality. If they could hit a node during that vulnerable window with the right kind of weapon, they might be able to disrupt the entire network that the node controlled. The team began a careful retreat, moving back toward their shuttle with the precious data they had gathered. But they had stayed too long. The swarm suddenly reacted to their presence, whether detecting their body heat or the electronic signals from their equipment. Entities began flowing toward them from every direction, shadows peeling away from walls and floors as the station came alive with hostile intent. Sergeant Price shouted for everyone to run as the Marines opened fire with their modified weapons. The energy beams had minimal effect on the entities, causing them to. The Calvari Military Council sat in stunned silence as Captain Jake Morrison outlined the human strategy for fighting the Void Swarm. Admiral Theron's 4 arms were crossed tightly across his chest, his luminescent skin flickering with colors that indicated deep confusion and growing anger. The other cavalry officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances that spoke of doubt and concern about what they were hearing. Jake stood at the center of the war room with Commander Lucas Bennett beside him, both humans presenting their battle plan with calm confidence that seemed completely at odds with what they were proposing. The holographic display showed the Kepler Nebula, a massive cloud of gas and dust located 3 light-years from the Calvari homeworld. This would be where the main Calvari fleet would engage the swarm in what would appear to be a desperate last stand. Admiral Theron finally broke his silence and spoke with barely contained disgust. He wanted to know if Jake was seriously asking the proud Calvari military to run away from the enemy. His people had fought with honor for thousands of years, standing their ground against every threat they had ever faced. The idea of retreating, of showing fear to the swarm, went against everything the Calvari believed about warfare and duty. Lucas corrected him immediately with the patience of someone explaining tactics to a student. The Calvari wouldn't be running away, they would be baiting the enemy. There was a significant difference between cowardice and strategy. The fleet would engage the swarm at the nebula and make it appear as though they were making their final desperate stand, drawing as many entities as possible into a single location. Meanwhile, human strike teams would be positioning themselves at every node location that Ryan had identified throughout the swarm's network. Structure. High Priestess Valara asked how the humans could possibly identify all the node locations across such vast distances. Ryan stood and explained his findings from the research station mission. The nodes operated on a very specific frequency that was now recorded in their databases. By analyzing the pattern of swarm movements across the sector, He had been able to map out where the major coordination points were located. There were approximately 50 primary nodes controlling the entities that threatened the Calvari Empire. Chief Engineer Sophie Martinez took over the presentation, showing the Calvari the weapons she had been developing in her workshop. She had been working non-stop since the reconnaissance mission, combining human engineering principles with Calvari technology to create something entirely new. The result was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Sophie gestured to the massive railguns being assembled in the Freedom's cargo bay. She explained that the swarm adapted to energy weapons, so humanity would use kinetic weapons instead. Old-fashioned solid projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. The swarm wouldn't detect the threat until the projectile was already passing through whatever dimensional phase they existed in. Each round would be loaded with a modified Calvari temporal bomb, programmed to detonate at the precise microsecond when the target node was vulnerable. One of the Calvari technical officers asked how they could possibly time the detonation with such precision. Sophie smiled and explained that human computers could calculate timing down to the nanosecond. They had been doing mathematical artillery calculations for over 1,000 years, accounting for wind, gravity, rotation of planets, and countless other variables. Timing a detonation to match a 7.3-second cycle was actually relatively simple by comparison. Lieutenant Emma Clark stepped forward to show them the second part of the human strategy. She brought up holographic displays of the neural disruptors, devices that the Calvari used for non-lethal crowd control. The humans had modified these devices to emit a very specific frequency that mimicked life force energy, but was fundamentally corrupted. When the temporal bombs froze the nodes in place, the disruptors would flood them with this poisoned energy. The effect would be devastating. The nodes would absorb what they thought was normal life energy and distribute it throughout their network. But instead of strengthening the swarm, the corrupted energy would create a feedback loop that cascaded through every entity connected to that node. The swarm's own adaptation protocols would work against them, trying to process energy that was designed to be unprocessable. Valara asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How much time would they have once the attack began? If even one part of the plan failed, if the timing was off by even a fraction, or if a single strike team was discovered too early, the entire strategy would collapse and the swarm would adapt to counter their tactics. Jake acknowledged that this was true. The plan required split-second timing across multiple light years, perfect coordination between species that had never worked together before, and a level of precision that left no room for error. Every strike team would have to hit their target at exactly the same moment. Every railgun would have to fire with perfect accuracy. Every temporal bomb would have to detonate during the brief window of vulnerability. If any single element failed, the swarm would survive and probably become immune to this type of attack in the future. Admiral Theron stood and spoke with frustration clear in his voice. He stated that this was not honorable combat. The Calvari had always fought their enemies face-to-face with courage and dignity. What the humans were proposing was deception, ambush, and tactics that seemed more like assassination than warfare. How could they accept help that required them to abandon their principles and fight without honor? Jake's response was quiet, but firm. He told the Admiral that humanity had given up on honor in warfare approximately 10,000 years ago, when humans had first realized that the only rule that mattered in combat was protecting those who depended on you. Everything else was just ego, just pride that got people killed for no good reason. The swarm didn't care about honor or fair fights. It simply consumed everything in its path. Fighting it with traditional tactics had failed spectacularly, as evidenced by the 12 colonies that no longer existed. Lucas added that humans had learned through bitter experience that survival sometimes required doing things that made you uncomfortable. Every major conflict in human history had taught them that the enemy didn't care about your principles or your sense of fair play. They only cared about winning. And if you wanted to protect innocent lives, you had to be willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve victory, even if it meant fighting dirty. The Calvari Council debated for hours. Some officers argued that accepting human methods would corrupt their culture and destroy everything they had built their civilization upon. Others pointed out that there would be no culture or civilization left if they died with their principles intact. A few suggested trying to find some middle ground between Calvari honor and human pragmatism, But Jake explained that half measures wouldn't work against an enemy like the swarm. Finally, Valara spoke up and ended the debate. She reminded her people that they had summoned humanity precisely because humans fought in ways the Calvari could not. They had known from the beginning that accepting human help would mean accepting human methods. The choice was simple: adapt to a new way of warfare or face extinction while clinging to outdated traditions. The vote was called and the decision made. The Calvary would follow the human battle plan. Admiral Theron accepted the decision with visible reluctance, but also with the discipline of a professional soldier following orders. He began coordinating with Lucas to prepare the Calvari fleet for their role in the coming battle. Over the next 3 days, the Freedom became the center of frantic activity. Sophie's engineering teams worked around the clock to manufacture railguns and install them on Calvari vessels. The weapons looked crude compared to the elegant energy cannons the Calvari normally used, but they were devastatingly effective. Ryan supervised the calibration of sensors that would detect the node vulnerability windows with precision. Emma drilled with Calvary pilots, teaching them the aggressive maneuvering tactics that human combat pilots had perfected over centuries. 50 strike teams were assembled, each consisting of human soldiers and Calvari warriors working together. Lieutenant Colonel Greg Patterson led the training sessions, teaching the Calvari how to move silently, how to think like hunters rather than honorable warriors, how to strike from surprise and disappear before the enemy could respond. The Calvari struggled with these concepts at first, but they were quick learners when they understood that their entire species depended on the success of this mission. The night before the battle, Jake stood on the Freedom's observation deck, looking out at the combined human and Calvary fleet. Dozens of ships floated in formation, an alliance between species that had never met before this crisis. He thought about the 300 colonists still sleeping in cryopods below, unaware of the war they had been pulled into. He wondered if they would approve of what he was doing, using their ship and crew to fight in an alien conflict. But he knew the answer already. Humans had always fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. It was written into their nature, this need to protect others even at great personal cost. The Freedom had been sent into space to find new worlds for humanity, but they had found something more impy. The battle began exactly as planned, with the Calvari fleet jumping to the Kepler Nebula and immediately broadcasting distress signals across all frequencies. Admiral Theron commanded his ships to engage the Void Swarm with every weapon they possessed, creating a spectacle of desperate defense that looked convincing because part of it was real. The Calvari warriors were putting themselves in genuine danger to sell the deception, firing their energy weapons knowing they would have no effect except to draw more enemies to their position. The swarm responded exactly as the humans had predicted. Entities converged on the nebula from across the sector, drawn by the concentration of life energy and the promise of a final feast that would end the Calvary resistance forever. Thousands of shadow forms flowed through space toward the fleet, moving with the coordinated precision that had destroyed so many civilizations before this one. At the same moment, 50 human strike teams materialized at node locations throughout the infected sectors. They had used a combination of Calvari teleportation technology and human stealth systems to position themselves without alerting the swarm to their presence. Each team carried railguns, temporal bombs, and neural disruptors, along with the determination to complete their mission no matter the cost. Lieutenant Colonel Greg Patterson led Alpha Team to the largest node cluster on a former colony world that had been completely consumed by void energy. His 6-person team moved through the ruins of what had once been a thriving city, stepping carefully around the empty shells of Calvari citizens who had died when the swarm came. The node pulsed in the center of the main plaza, surrounded by dozens of entities that circled it like sharks around prey. Corporal Amy Rodriguez crouched behind the remains of a building and checked her equipment one final time. She was the tech specialist responsible for timing the attack perfectly. Her instruments tracked the node's vulnerability cycle with computer precision, counting down the seconds until the 7.3 moment when they could strike. She whispered into her communication device that they had 30 seconds until the firing window opened. Greg raised his hand and his team took their positions. The railgun was already aimed at the target, its magnetic coils charged and ready to accelerate the projectile to devastating speed. The temporal bomb sat in the firing chamber, programmed to detonate at exactly the right microsecond. Everything depended on timing, coordination, and a little bit of luck. Amy's countdown reached 0 and Greg gave the signal. The railgun fired with a sound like thunder, the projectile crossing the distance to the node faster than the swarm could react. The slug struck during the brief vulnerability window and the temporal bomb detonated, freezing the node in a bubble of stopped time. In that frozen moment, the neural disruptor activated and flooded the node with corrupted energy that looked like life force but carried death in its structure. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The node convulsed as the poisoned energy entered its network and began to spread. Every entity connected to that node started to shake and writhe, their coordinated movements breaking down into chaos. The corruption spread through their communication systems like a virus, turning their own adaptation protocols against them as they tried to process energy that was fundamentally designed to be unprocessable. Across 50 different locations, the same scenario played out with military precision. Human teams struck at nodes in perfect synchronization, each one adding another cascade failure to the swarm's network. The entities that had never known defeat suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't play by any rules they understood, an enemy that turned their greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. In the Kepler Nebula, Admiral Theron watched in amazement as the swarm attacking his fleet suddenly began to collapse. Entities turned on each other in confusion as the feedback loop corrupted their coordination. Ships that had been moments away from being overrun found themselves surrounded by thrashing shadows that seemed to be destroying themselves without any further input from the Calvari weapons Zatai. Priestess Valara stood in the Grand Temple monitoring the battle through holographic displays. She saw node after node go dark as the human strategy proved devastatingly effective. For the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. The humans had done the impossible, found a weakness that the Calvari had missed and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. But then something changed. Ryan Cooper noticed it first from his position aboard the Freedom, his instruments detecting an energy spike that made no sense according to their understanding of how the swarm operated. He contacted Jake immediately with panic clear in his voice, explaining that all the remaining swarm entities across the entire sector were converging on a single point. They were merging together, combining into something unprecedented. Emma pulled up the tactical display and her face went pale. The scattered entities were joining into a single massive consciousness, pooling their remaining strength into one last, desperate gambit. Every reading suggested this unified form would be powerful enough to consume an entire solar system in hours. If it succeeded in feeding on that much life energy, it would become truly unstoppable. Jake asked where the thing was going, and the answer made everyone's blood run cold. The Calvari homeworld, the most densely populated planet in the sector with billions of potential victims. The unified swarm was heading straight for the largest concentration of life force available, and it would arrive within hours. Valara's hologram appeared on the bridge with an expression of calm acceptance that was somehow worse than panic. She thanked Jake and his crew for trying, for giving her people hope in their final days. She stated that there was no way to evacuate billions of Calvary in the time they had left. The homeworld would fall and the swarm would become unstoppable after feeding on so many victims. Jake slammed his fist on the arm of his captain's chair and said they weren't done fighting yet. He demanded options from his crew, anything that could stop or slow down this massive entity before it reached the homeworld. The bridge fell into frantic activity as everyone searched for solutions that seemed increasingly impossible to find. Lucas studied the tactical data with the cold calculation of a military strategist facing an unsolvable problem. He noted that the swarm was pulling energy from every remaining node to create this unified form. The individual entities were combining, which meant they were concentrating all their power into a single target. If they could hit that target with enough force to disrupt its cohesion, they might be able to tear it apart before it could feed and grow stronger. Ryan immediately pointed out the flaw in that plan. The unified swarm was already too large to be affected by conventional weapons. They would need something that could disrupt dimensional bonds at a fundamental level, something with enough power to literally tear apart the fabric of space-time in the area where the entity existed. Nothing in their arsenal had that kind of capability. Sophie's voice was quiet when she spoke up from the engineering station. She mentioned the Freedom's reactor, explaining that if they overloaded it and detonated it inside the swarm's dimensional phase, the resulting cascade might be powerful enough to shatter the entity's cohesion. The explosion would create a rupture in space-time itself, tearing apart anything caught in the dimensional collapse. The bridge went completely silent as everyone understood what she was suggesting. Valara's hologram flickered as she realized the implications, her luminescent skin going dim with shock. She stated that such an action would destroy the Freedom completely. Everyone on board would die in the explosion. Jake nodded slowly and said they would evacuate the crew first using shuttles and set the reactor to overload on a timer. They could remote pilot the Freedom into the swarm's core and detonate it from a safe distance. Even as he spoke, he knew it wouldn't work. Lucas voiced what everyone was thinking. The shuttles couldn't evacuate 300 people quickly enough, and someone would need to stay behind to fly the ship manually in case the swarm changed position or the remote systems failed. The captain stood and made his decision. He would stay behind and pilot the Freedom on its final mission. Lucas would take command of the survivors and get them to safety. Before anyone could argue, Jake ordered the evacuation to begin immediately. They had less than 3 hours before the swarm reached the Calvari homeworld, but Emma stepped forward and refused to leave. She pointed out that Jake was a decent pilot, but she was better, and if this mission required precision flying through dimensional distortions, they needed the best. Sophie joined her, explaining that managing a reactor overload of this magnitude was a 2-person job minimum. Someone needed to monitor the cascade and ensure it detonated at exactly the right moment. Nora stated she would stay to coordinate communications with the Calvary fleet, making sure they were positioned to protect the evacuation shuttles. Ryan said he needed to document everything for the historical record, and to ensure future generations understood what happened here. Greg and Amy volunteered to handle weapons and navigation. One by one, 12 crew members refused to evacuate, choosing instead to stay aboard for the final mission. Jake tried to order them to leave, but they simply ignored him. They weren't following orders anymore.